Today we will talk about the interesting play of light in one of my favorite shows, Land of the Lustrous. Land of the Lustrous is a nice pick for its uses of light because the show exists for the most part within the 3D plane. The light plays off the shimmering nature of gemstones, even going as far as to add frequent sparkling effects onto hair or blades. Dia, for example, has shots where everything about them emanates light, whether a part of them directly or not, even forgoing the necessity of daylight to cast light around themselves. We even see in the initial marketing for the show that they intended to keep this shimmering and reflective nature within the 2D plane, but frankly, I think it works a lot better with the way we eventually got it. But I think before we hop into some of the more specific uses of light, a good starting point is within the scope of the world itself. A lot of shows get so caught up in their characters that we often forget that setting plays a larger role in scene diversity. So we often get these eternal daytime scenarios, and even in some of my favorite shows, the environment will change, but the course of the episode doesn't really exist beyond the scope of morning to afternoon. Early into the series, we are introduced to the idea of natural light playing a large part into the atmosphere surrounding our characters. Sometimes it's less apparent and comes in the form of adding depth to blowing grasslands. Other times, it's more clearly laid out in the form of an entire sequence. Our first example of this comes from episode 6. Foss finally gets to play with the big kids and patrol for Lunarians. The episode presents Foss's involvement as something triumphant because, well, it is a pretty massive event. Imagine a situation where you live hundreds of years and you're pretty useless amongst your peers, and then all of a sudden, you're just equal to them. The pale morning skies and little creatures bouncing about allow the viewer to feel relaxed in the face of Foss's tense behavior. And this is how they use a daytime cycle to their advantage here, because progressively the mood is dictated by the light cast by a changing sun. After this slick little transition, we get to see some absolutely gorgeous sunset colors. Pretty much, I think the creators want to build this idea in your mind that this daytime cycle is uneventful and pretty relaxing. This is why they even further this by making it a montage to reinforce the mundane nature of this patrol job that Foss seems to think is like the pinnacle of existence. Where they twist this logic is when the Lunarians attack during sunset and basically kill the twins, changing a beautiful image into a more sinister one. So the viewer in this stead is left to debate the association of the daylight period with scene progression. This is a pretty unique sequence to me because it really takes a backseat to the actual scene in question, but still matters due to the way we will see the creators always choosing to play with the viewer's expectations and keeping their attention vigilant. My favorite sequence that illustrates this idea nicely is in episode 10. Dia is being hunted by the big Lunarian and, they're scared. If you notice, throughout the series, the windows are always open, they show the nice blue sky with some clouds letting in that natural light, but eventually, though, we get to a point where the creators are like, wait a second, we can do whatever we want, so I'm gonna just make this a metaphor. So the windows slowly get more consumed by white light, and it becomes an entire idea of Dia being trapped by two enemies, their insecurities as a composite gem and a Lunarian. The strategy here is not to outright block out all light from entering the scene, but enough to make the scene claustrophobic for Dia, metaphorically, so that when they eventually overcome their personal turmoil, the space opens up to be pretty gigantic in reality. I mean, look at what they did to make this scene work. They transformed the scene into a literal Colosseum fight by the end of it. Really nice use of the 3D space to create some actually interesting flavor to this scene. And by far, I think this scene and its pretty simple use of mood manipulation provides the most dynamic sequence in the show. Other shows I've seen over the years have tried to replicate this to some degree, but I don't think they're cutting it. Moving on, sometimes they use light to misdirect or create mystique for a viewer. One case is in episode 3 where Cinnabar is alarmed by a Lunarian attack in the nighttime, which is a first. This has never happened before. Only to find out momentarily it's just the insanely sharp glow of Dia taking a power nap. Some might say giving out false expectations this much creates unnecessary distrust in a viewer, or makes future drama not all the more serious, but I tend to argue the contrary here. This is a show that tries its best to keep the viewer guessing about what direction its free-flowing narrative will take, and I think when presented with something like this, we have an intrigue into the conceptual play of light and dark in a viewer's mind. During the day, the Lunarian signal is presented through growing dark sunspots, while during the nighttime it is presented with a bright light, creating a contrast to inspire some imagination into a viewer, and even if it is for a brief moment, I think it's cool. Another good example of this is the use of parallel imagery in episodes 4 and 8. In episode 4, we see Foss in an interesting situation. After talking to Ventricosus, they create prophetic imagery between them using heavenly light to cast shadows on Foss and the ocean floor. When I first saw this scene, I interpreted it as like a god versus man juxtaposition, but eventually it became a bit more clear to me that the idea here is a bit more associated with a higher place like Nirvana, communicating with Foss to represent Samsara, aka rebirth and suffering. The show repeats this image in episode 8 where Foss gains their new arms. And this time, they pose this scene as a gift from the heavens, where by pure coincidence, heavenly light seemingly falls onto Foss once again. The imagery and scenarios used in both of these scenes are used to preface a major characterization moment in the form of a rebirth for Foss. I would even say that these moments are meant to be interpreted as destined, but I wouldn't go as far as to say that Foss's journey is fatalistic, though. Their will often leads them to shape the reality around them. Even if these two events do happen sort of against their will, Foss wanted to be in the field desperately, so is it true that they share some of the blame for these events occurring? Maybe. You can decide. Let's talk more about what this light means. We already know that the show likes to play with your expectations, but it's cool that these particular ones give you a false sense of security here, as we will come to see. In exchange for Foss's new arms, they lose a genuine inspiration to them in the form of Antarcticite. Antarcticite's death will prove to be a true tormentor that even pushes Foss's mind so far that even a crucial character moment like helping Cinnabar was forgotten for a second. So for this scene, it's pretty awesome to basically say that the higher plane of existence deems this moment a sacred and prophetic event, but for those around Foss, it means a lot different. But aside from this initial setup scene, this episode in particular has a lot of moving parts, mostly the color play. But I do want to compliment the conscious effort to play with a confined dark space in comparison to this wide open snowy area. There's some real loss of innocence, slash, literally Mr. Brightside coming out of your cage moment here, but the reason they try so much harder on the second scene is that 1, they really want to hammer home the visual relationship and difference between these two entities, and 2, this is pretty much the climax of the entire show. I mean, Foss is literally blossoming like a flower here. One thing to note is that this scene basically poses for certain now that Foss is a burden to gems that give him a chance. In this case, their lack of capability produced the demise of Antarcticite. Foss feels trapped into feeling like they constantly need to amend their own sense of being to fit the needs of the gems, but really it just ends up making multiple gems suffer. We understand as a viewer that the one that really gave Foss a chance is, clearly Antarcticite. Amethyst and Dia did their best, but obviously not enough to make the dramatic flashback, though. What about this light in a more conceptual Buddhism way? As most people understand, the show has significant elements of Buddhist themes and imagery woven into most of the series, and if you are interested, I found an excellent video analyzing it, which I will link in the description. So let's delve into the concept of Lotus Sutra and our inner light. To start, I will read some excerpts from The Wisdom of the Lotus Sutra by Daisaku Ikeda. The Lotus Sutra teaches of the great hidden treasure of the heart, as vast as the universe itself, which dispels any feelings of powerlessness. It teaches a dynamic way of living in which we breathe the immense life of the universe itself. It teaches the true great adventure of self-reformation. The Lotus Sutra has the breadth and scope to embrace all people on the way to peace. The humanism of the Lotus Sutra comes down to the tenet of treasuring the individual. This is the Buddhist spirit. The Lotus Sutra's fundamental objective of universal enlightenment begins with treasuring the individual and can only be realized through steadfast adherence to this point. Let me expand on that idea. This ideal teaches us to accept ourselves and the vast universe as just where we are meant to be. But this secret is locked away deep inside our hearts, basically guiding us to mold our lives through experience. Only after reaching the true stability and knowing oneself and the vastness of everything, then you can reach enlightenment. Now, to connect this ideal to the grand narrative at hand, in my opinion, I believe the story is progressing in the way of spiritual enlightenment through chaos and suffering. And I do think Foss as a character is going to eventually reach a point where their combined bodily reformation equates to a level of truly treasuring themselves and treasuring other sentient beings as well. I also believe that the heavenly light they parallel here is a direct reference to the light being emitted from the Buddha between his eyebrows to illuminate the heavens. Although in the show they pose it as the heavens illuminating Foss, the idea is still pretty much the same. Another element to consider is that if we are to believe that the gems resemble humankind in some way, then it is safe to believe that their gemstone glow is akin to the Buddhist luminous mind. There are quite a few interpretations of this concept, but I think that in the case of Foss, the starting point of their gemstone glow was pretty much the definitive purity of mind and heart, which then, as some schools of thought describe, their mind was contaminated by kleshas or poison. By the end of the series, it's clear that there is envy within Foss for the less disturbed existence that they led before, but the path ahead is just far too important. Now we can move on to the character base uses. The most apparent one I notice is in cases of emotional height. In episode 4, they do a quick backstory segment for Cinnabar, and I really like how they play with a lot of ideas here. First off, the symbolism with the geraniums. I saw this really amazing blog post about the flower language of the show, and I wanted to share some of it here. The white geranium, from the Japanese standpoint, correlates to distrust and indecision from what I understand. So in this scene, we see Cinnabar interact with the flower in a way leading us to believe they distrust in the hearts of those around them, and they don't believe that other gems could love them the same way they love other gems. And this indecision comes from both Cinnabar and Congo in trying to find a place for themselves in this gem society. So, to this end, the flower is highlighted with this faint glow, eerily similar to the glow of the moon that we see Cinnabar pretty much solely reside under because, they're the Night Watch guy. And I feel like the creators really want to make this contrast with Cinnabar's affection because the visual language shows them pulling away from Congo. That one's obvious. But also because the moonlight glow is not represented when they are amongst others, but it is present when they are alone. This is a great way to build an atmosphere for a character in a pretty quick fashion. Not so much that it becomes a full on flashback, but just enough to give you a peek into the history of the character without receiving it directly through them. My next example comes from episode 10. This is a quicker one, but it's the little details that count. Right after Bort requests Foss to team up, it's time to break the news to Daya. Daya's room is illuminated with a beautiful spot of light while the rest of the room sort of contains this energy. Upon hearing this hurtful news, Daya's beautiful room light dies as she does inside. I mean, your partner for hundreds of years wants to partner with someone better. That's kind of crazy. But the light inside them returns once they realize the opportunity Foss is presented with, which ideally is enough for them to be happy. Daya is a gem pleaser after all, but that isn't to say that this event didn't hurt them still, as I covered earlier with their Lunarian scene. What's interesting here, beyond the scope of, the small visual play, is the idea that Daya creates by saying Foss has a new shine to them now. Or the direct quote, "the way you shine now," is a line that speaks to the progression of Foss's being as different entirely even at this point. This leads me to my next character moment, episode 4 once again. Ventricosis tries to explain death in the most "this is the narrative arc for your character" type of way, but hey, I really didn't even notice this until my third rewatch. The brilliance in this scene plays into the heavenly light idea for the first time, but you really gotta be an attentive viewer. As Foss and Ventricosis progress through the idea of death equating to someone's true self being gone for good and unreachable, the light slowly creeps in. And we even go far enough to use reflections of Foss's body to be like, "Yo, I feel you, bro." If Foss did not betray Congo's command here, it would be akin to betraying their own sense of being. At least that's what I interpret it as because, they related with Ventricosis so much. Another thing to note is that this light, unlike the other two instances, doesn't try to play with your expectations just yet. Like Foss, the viewer is also naive to what's going on big picture wise, so for them to present us with this even before a big climactic moment is a nice little touch that I really didn't appreciate my first time because I didn't even notice it existed. That's really all I got for you today, but I hope you enjoyed the video. If you would like to support me in the creation of more content like this, please check me out on Patreon. Thanks for watching.